What's up, everyone?
Selected.
This
Screen
is
recording button.
Be Well Informed, and this episode is more of a basically looking at things from different perspectives. Something I really like to do, really like to explain to other people, because I think it makes you realize how nuanced life really is. Like you really don't think about things like this. Like most people think in a certain pattern, a certain way, a certain uh, position. Um, but I'd like to change it up because it makes you realize that you don't really know all that much. You don't really see all things um, properly all that much. Not necessarily that it's improperly the way you're seeing things, but it's only one way out of like a whole list of ways of seeing things. And then putting those different ways of seeing things together into one huge mega perspective is what I like to do. So in this episode, we're going to be talking about self-consciousness and how actually self-consciousness is not actually about, is more about the other person rather than it is about the self. Not the self is not uh, part of that understanding, but it's more about how the other sees the self. It's more about how you perceive, honestly, than how the other actually sees the self. 99 times out of 100, it's more about how you perceive how the other is seeing you rather than how the other is actually seeing you. And that's what like 99% of anxiety is about. 99% of anxiety is not real. It's about how you think the other person is going to perceive you, or how you perceive something that isn't necessarily actually that way at all. And that's true for a lot of things, anxiety, depression, things like this, sadness. When it comes to like a breakup or something, 90% of it, especially anxiety, is actually because you perceive something that isn't necessarily that way at all. So I make this video because it's an interesting concept to go over. So let's begin. So what is self-consciousness? And is it the same as self-awareness? The answer to this is yes and no. I would mostly say no, because self-awareness means that you're aware of your own self-consciousness, and you're aware of the fact that it isn't actually just a perception. It's not actually reality. One of these days, I'm going to do a video about wrong thought. And I'm not saying wrong thought as in, bad thought. You should be thinking these thoughts, but thoughts that actually cause more emotionality than, is necessary, and than is required for the situation. One day I'm going to do that video because it's a very important topic to talk about. But for this particular episode, we're just going to be talking about self-consciousness because it's one of the most interesting things to know about yourself, that you perceive things in ways that they aren't actually. And so when you're perceiving the things in the way that you think they are, what you're actually doing is you're not actually seeing reality. What you're seeing is what you think is reality, or what your mind is telling you is reality, or what your mind is fearing is reality, or what actually isn't reality necessarily. And 99 times out of 100, it turns out not to be reality. So why is self-consciousness about the other more than it is about yourself? So in order to understand this, we're going to have to understand what self-consciousness is in the first place. Self-consciousness, in general, wide term, very broad in general terms, is where you are conscious, or you're conscious about how others may perceive you, and so there we are. We're it's more about the other rather than the self. There's nothing wrong with this necessarily. It's more about understanding yourself and becoming more self-aware. Because this is one of the things that because you're not aware of yourself, because you're not aware of these problems, you keep repeating them and you get stuck in them. You're going to be repeating the same problems unless you see them, unless you're aware of what they actually are. And that does take work, takes time to do, because you have to uncover them, then you have to look at them, and then you have to realize why they may not necessarily match reality, and that takes time and it takes work and it takes a lot of observation of yourself. So self-consciousness is more about you perceiving are you being afraid of how others perceive you. And so there is a bit of the you in there, but there's no self-awareness there really, because self-awareness is basically being able to be aware of what the self is thinking, perceiving, and whatnot. And I would also add that self-awareness at a certain level, at a very high level, when you get to a certain level of self-awareness, it's being able to see when an understanding or a perspective that you have about yourself or reality is actually a perception rather than actual reality.
YouTube now. The Jimmy Dore Show. Bill Clinton caught in photos with Jeffrey Epstein user.
It takes a lot of
Attachment.
work because takes a lot of work because you have to sit there and you have to go into the idea and you have to say, well, is this necessarily what's real? Is this necessarily what's accurate?
Cellular airplane mode. Switch button off. Screen mirroring. Flashlight. Type camera. Notes. Selected. Screen recording button. Double tap and hold to show more controls. Hard. Swipe up or down to select a custom action. Then double tap to activate.
It's hard to know because it's one of those weird things that when you're not aware of your misperceptions, basically, or when you're not aware that they are actually perceptions and perspectives, you become trapped by them. You can be stuck in them, and then you start thinking of them as real, and that they actually represent reality. And part of this has to do with your mind. Your mind, gives this idea of validity to certain ideas, which makes them stronger. Certain thoughts, which makes them stronger. And then it takes these thoughts and says, "This is reality. This is what we know." When that's not necessarily what's happening in reality, in the first place. Because you're not aware of these thoughts, because you're not aware that they are thoughts and perspectives and perceptions of things, you mistake them for reality. It's pretty common, especially when you're low on this level of consciousness. By the way, when I'm saying you're low on the level of consciousness, that's not a bad thing necessarily. It's not that you're, more primitive or inferior or something. It's just the way things can be. And it's not about better or more so much as it is about what works, what is true, what is healthy, and what serves you, and or basically what works for you. And that takes some work too, because you have to understand yourself, and then you have to understand how that relates to the world, and that takes a lot of work to do. But it's not really something that you have to do. But if you want to make your life easier, it would be a good idea to do that. I might make an episode, I might make a video about practices for self-awareness, because it's a very important thing. I think self-awareness is actually the least known and understood thing, but it's also the most important thing in a lot of ways. Because if you don't have self-awareness, you don't really know how to change these things. Or you can't change these things. There's a good episode from a channel called actualized.org called Awareness Alone is Curative. And basically the idea from the episode was that if you are aware of something long enough, say you have an addiction to eating greasy, dirty food. If you become aware of yourself with this addiction and you eating this greasy, dirty food, it may take you time. It may take you 3 or 4 times to do this, maybe more. But eventually, you're going to be like, "Oh, this is what it's doing to me." If you become aware of doing that, and then you become aware of the afterward of what happens to your body after that, then you might be able to kind of fix it. Or at least you're so aware of it at that point that you're not, nearly as smitten by it, basically. So basically, lack of awareness equals lack of ability to change or understand. It's like, because I don't really think it's about changing so much as it's about understanding what it is, understanding why it is, understanding what it's doing and why it's doing it. And this understanding leads to a lot more freedom from this thing, because you realize what it is, why it is, what it's doing, all these things are, what it is exactly that you now understand. And that's one of the things that self-consciousness doesn't actually do. What self-consciousness actually is a perception of what you think somebody's perception could be of what is actually reality. So there's a bunch of layers to this to unpack. Alright. So if you have this idea that you think somebody perceives you as, a loser or something, and then you basically what you're going to be doing is you're going to be doing it and saying and thinking things and feeling things based on this idea that you have. And people are going to perceive you as whatever you think they're going to perceive you as. And so this type of perspective, this type of idea kind of takes over your mind and your life, and you think this is reality. Because you're not really aware of what the thoughts are. It was one of those things when I was younger. I suppose I had some of that, this is self-consciousness and introversion. Sometimes, they can sometimes go together, but it's not really about introversion so much as it's about how your self-consciousness is making you act.
YouTube now, 42, the day the world didn't end, attachment.
And making you perceive things that aren't necessarily that way at all.
Airplane mode, switch, flashlight, screen mirroring, flash, timer, calculate, camera, button, notes, selected, screen recording, button, speech off.
There we go. Hopefully it'll stop that for now. And so, there's not really any techniques on this episode. I just wanted to make this episode to explain to you what self-consciousness really is. I might do more episodes like this in the future about other things. Like sadness, what sadness really is, what anger really is. I've done a couple episodes. I've done an episode on my podcast about what anger is, but I haven't really done one on what self-consciousness is, because it's not really, it's one of those weird things about self-consciousness that you don't really have a whole lot of people who understand it, especially the people that have it. The people that get it and deal with it don't really know what it really is, and they don't really understand why it is. They understand why it is, but they don't really see like what it really is. And this is a big problem. This is why so many people get so emotional about things, and so many people take things out of context and things like this, because they perceive what the person is saying as utterly different than what the person was actually saying. And so this kind of creates this problem of misperceiving. I think this is what 90% of the problems. I don't know what to say 90%, but I'd be willing to bet about 60 to 75% of the misunderstandings around what people are saying have to do with this, if not more, because people perceive something in a completely different way than what they're saying, and if you're not aware of this, if you're not aware of how this works, you're gonna fall into this trap. You're gonna keep getting stuck in this, and you still may get stuck in it, but you'll be more aware of it, and you'll be more aware of what it's doing, which is really the important thing here. So, anyways, this is Be Well Informed. I'm gonna I might make another another video today. We'll see what happens. So, anyways, this is Be Well Informed, and I'll talk to you in the next episode.